When you lose your job and you have to job hunt again, there comes the inevitable task of having to update your resume. It's so daunting. But before getting into it this time around, I had someone who has much more experience than me in the tech industry look through my resume and edit it. They critiqued it, and obviously it's a good idea to get feedback from people who are where you want to be one day. Obviously, I can't keep doing the same thing over and over again and be expecting different results. Personally, I obviously couldn't really see any flaws in my resume because I've been looking at it for so long, so I need to get a fresh new pair of eyes. So to help me achieve Project AMG, what better person to edit my resume than someone who's worked at Google before? After watching my video, he reached out and offered to critique my resume, so I'm like, yeah, why not? I can definitely learn a couple things. Obviously, I'll keep his identity private, but he's a beast. He worked at Tesla, Zoox, Google, and Cruise, all in the span of 8 years, and all mechanical or hardware engineering related roles. He's older than I am though, so that's, obviously makes sense. But hey, that makes him the perfect person to critique my resume. So this is what my resume looks like now before any of his feedback or any of his critique. I'll share what his feedback was because he sent me a 2-page PDF outlining all the different things I could change in my resume to make it better. And then I'll show you the changes I made and what my new resume actually looks like. Starting off, he prefaced his feedback by saying to obviously only use what worked for me because at the end of the day, this is just his opinion. That's fair. Generally, he said, though it seems like my resume relies heavily upon my portfolio. It doesn't necessarily mean that my portfolio is bad, but I just need to emphasize and add more details in the resume section as well. Specifically, I need to focus more on my full-time work experience, like from my times at Tesla, Serve Robotics, and Volta, and I really don't need to include my internship experience in my resume anymore, because it's been almost 3 years since I graduated university. I don't know how it's been that long, but somehow it has. Obviously, as I add more detail on my full-time experience, I'm gonna need that space, and I'm not gonna make my resume longer than a page, so yeah, I'm gonna get rid of my internship experience. That's a good point. I don't even know why I didn't think of that myself. I really don't know why I still have Blended, Valideer, and Ecobee on my resume. I'm just gonna fill up the 3 full-time sections and just focus on those. An interesting thing he mentioned is he did say that he keeps a slide deck handy for when he does interviews. That slide deck has pictures from all the projects he worked on in his job. Usually in interviews, I will just share my screen and show my portfolio when talking about my work, but usually I can't add too much detail there. But having a slide deck is actually really smart because then you can kind of add more detail and really only share it with people that are interested in interviewing you. I'm still working on a slide deck that I can eventually share with interviewers once I get to that stage. So specifically looking at my Volta Energy job description, this is what I currently have in my resume, and this is the feedback he had for me. First, saying electronic enclosure is not enough. I need to specify what it did, how it was made, the production volume, and the materials I used in the electronic enclosure. I also need to add more detail about the prototype fixture I mentioned here. When I say rapid testing and delivering early tangible concepts, that part is redundant. Yes, he has a point. Honestly, I don't even know why I have that there. He also mentioned how I need to add more detail on this test rig that I worked on. He didn't specify exactly what kind of detail, but I'm guessing he wants to know about what it was used for and how it was made. And finally, it looks like I should also mention the cross-functional teams I worked with. All this makes sense. Usually I like to add these details in my portfolio section, but from his perspective, it matters a lot that I have these details in my resume section as well. So I'll make sure to do that. Moving on, we have the Serve Robotics experience. This is what I currently have in my resume when I'm talking about Serve Robotics. And here's how he recommended I improve it. First, saying sub-assemblies is not enough. I should really talk more about the specific parts and sub-assemblies I worked on and what their function was. I guess that makes sense. I guess the reason I never really did it before is because I was worried because I know how secretive companies like that can be. And I don't want to share too much detail, but I guess it's fine as long as I don't include any images of the work itself. I also do mention cameras quite a bit in the job description, so he wanted me to add a little bit more detail on these cameras. For example, did I test the effect of vibration on image quality and field of view coverage? Did I do TAs or tolerance analysis? Was camera positional and angular tolerance important? Did I test for stray light or need light baffles? I'm not gonna lie, I don't really know what the last one means because I've never really dealt with that before, but I had had to do some extra Googling to figure out what that means, or ask ChatGPT. That being said, the first 2 points I can answer, the last 2 I never really took into consideration, so I'm not gonna talk about them on my resume in case in a future interview they ask me extra details about it. I don't want to lie and then not be able to answer an interview question. Also here, when I say optimize the line, he wants more information on how exactly I did that. Also, when I say to control position variability for manufacturing and assembly, he said that was redundant, and honestly, yeah, I agree with him. Again, sometimes I do things I don't realize in the moment that they're wrong, but looking back on it, I was like, yeah, why would I include that? That is so redundant. That's just unnecessary to even have. He also wanted me to talk a little bit about thermal simulations, how I did them, and kind of what cross-functional teams I worked with. Also here, when I say RCA, that's not enough. I need to specifically say the specific issue that happened and how I solved it. Yeah, that makes sense. When I remember the specific bullet point when I was talking about it. I thought about adding more detail, but then I was like, I don't really have enough space, so I'll keep it like this, and they can ask me more details about it in the interview. But now that I'm getting rid of my internship experience on my resume, yeah, I can add more detail. Also, because of space, again, usually a lot of these details are added in my portfolio, but now I know I need to add more detail in my resume while still keeping my portfolio. Moving on, we have Tesla. This is what my Tesla job description looks like on my resume. And here's how he recommended I improve it. First, more details on the actual parts I worked on. Like, what were they? And if I can, specifically how I launched these parts. Second, when I say new attachment features and load paths, he wants more specific details on what that means. Third, again, and I've noticed this particular critique in every single one of my job description, but he wants to know who I worked with cross-functionally. I didn't realize talking about the other teams that I work with would be so important, but I guess it is. I guess talking about the fact that I work with the manufacturing team, the design team, the thermals team, all that is super important. He also asked if I did any build support on the line from my time at Tesla. I really didn't do much, so I'm not gonna add and talk about that when I didn't do it. The vehicle was in its early design stage, so never really had to do that. It would have been cool though. Like, I've been to the manufacturing plant, but I didn't actually do any extra build support. It was more like for observational purposes and learning experiences. A very interesting thing he mentioned though is obviously I can't include Tesla in my portfolio, right? They're super secretive. But he said I can find images online of parts that are similar to the parts I worked on and include those in my portfolio. That's so smart. I don't know, I never thought of that. It's a pretty smart way of getting around the NDA while still talking about your work. And there's really nothing wrong with showing pictures that are already publicly available online. This makes sense. The feedback is pretty constructive, and I learned a lot just from looking through his feedback. Now, that was the most important part, I think, of his feedback. He did mention about other stuff too, like my intern stuff. He mentioned to take all that out completely, and fair, that makes sense. I've been in the industry for 3 years now. I really don't need it. Now, obviously, part of me feels a little bit bad about taking it out completely because it's like a little bit nostalgic, like that's like my time and effort. But, it makes sense. I gotta take it out. Time to get over it. Next, about the skills section that I have, he talks about how it's kind of irrelevant that I maybe explain the skill a little bit. The most I can do about this section is just write the skill itself in bullet points, but I don't need to add all this extra fluff that I have around the skills. Plus, any skill that I have in my skill section, I need to somehow include how it was used in the experience section. So for example, I have DFMEA, C++, and Python in the skills section, but I don't have them nearly at all actually in the experience section. I genuinely barely use C++ and Python, so honestly I'm just gonna remove those skills entirely. They're not that useful for a mechanical engineering role. But yeah, DFMEA is super important, so I'm gonna include that in my experience. Now for the project section, he's right, that's not really needed. I mean, I can just talk about these projects specifically in my portfolio. Also, in almost every interview I did, people always ask me about the experiences, but no one ever questions or asks any questions about skills and projects on the resume section. So yeah, I can just take that out. If I've never been asked an interview or a follow-up question about it, clearly they never really read it or cared about it too much, so I can just remove it. That's kind of my justification. Now for the education section, interestingly enough, he said to remove my GPA. Yeah, I guess that's fair. I guess it doesn't really matter anymore. My work experience is what matters most. It's just, for 4 or 5 years, I worked super hard to get that GPA. So I kind of wanted to include it, but it kind of goes to show how no one really cares about your grades, specifically in engineering. Unless you're doing a master's or a PhD, your grades do not matter, as long as you're not failing, obviously. At this point in my career, my work experience is way more valuable than any grade that I have. No one has ever asked to see my transcript. Like, never. Not even my internships, to be honest. Now, you know I love bags, and this has been my go-to travel bag recently. Bellroy, who was sponsoring this part of the video, sent me the Transit backpack. I used it a while ago when a tech company flew me out to SF to do an on-site interview. That backpack was more than enough. I didn't even need the extra carry-on from my time there. Here's exactly how much I was able to fit in this bag. Now, this large main pocket opens up like a suitcase, and it fit all my undergarments, pajamas, shirts, pants, flannels, hoodie, a jacket, and some toiletries with a little belt on top to keep it all in place. This is enough for like a 3 or 4 day trip. Now we can rotate the bag and store all my tech here, like my MacBook and iPad. There's a little zip up opening where I can store my laptop charger and mouse, and in this soft small pocket at the top, I'll put my AirPods and Apple Pencil for quick access. Next, in this front pocket, I'll put my camera, mic, and little tripod. It's just so satisfying, again, to have everything organized in its like own little zone. There's usually 3 zones I have when traveling: clothes, tech, and filming. I'll also put this travel folio here in the front pocket because that front pocket is deep, but the travel folio just has my passport, some cards, and the SIM card remover thingy. And finally, I have these 2 back pockets. Usually in one of them I'll put my sunglasses, and in the other I'll put like pens and pencils. If you're interested, I'll put a link in the video description that'll give you 10% off the entire range at bellroy.com. Moving on, taking all this amazing feedback in, this is what my resume looks like now. First thing you'll notice, it's a 1-column resume. I'm not doing the 2-column resume anymore, mainly because he said, again, I don't need the project section and I don't need the skills section in the way that I had it. So I was like, okay, there's no need to have that 2nd column anymore. I just want to purely focus on the experience section. But initially, I had the experience and education, and that was it. But it felt empty. Like I felt like I needed an extra section, another thing. And that's kind of why I came up with the summary of qualifications section, just like a short little intro about myself. That if that's all they read, they'd know I'm qualified for a mechanical engineering or mechanical design engineering role. And yeah, so basically just kind of, I thought about it like summarizing all my work experiences into one. Or if I look at any mechanical engineering job description, like my summary of qualifications has everything they're looking for in the job description, if that makes sense. So you'll notice in the summary of qualification, first thing I talk about is, my experience with 3D models, CAD software. I also talk about the kind of CAD software I used. So I've used SolidWorks at Serve Robotics, CATIA at Tesla, and Onshape at Volta Energy. So I mentioned all the different CAD softwares that I've experience with. Also in mechanical engineering, DFM and DFA matters a lot, so I have to include it there. GD&T, make sure to include that in my 2nd bullet point. Root cause analysis, failure mode and effects analysis, make sure I include that. I also talked about kind of my experience, making presentations and proposing solutions. It's not as much of a technical skill, but I've done it enough times that I think it's worth including. I also talked about cross-functional teams, since from my critiquer's point of view, he mentioned cross-functional teams so much, and it's obviously something I've done. I've done it a lot. I work with so many different teams, so I was like, you know what? I have to include it in my summary of qualifications. And finally, manufacturing is so important, and being able to design for manufacturing is also really important. So I mentioned all the particular manufacturing process I worked with. Injection molding, CNC machining, and sheet metal forming. They're all super important. I've worked with all of them. I've been asked a lot of interview questions about them, so it makes sense to just include it in my summary of qualifications. And again, 3 sections just looks cleaner than just having 2 sections. Moving on, let's look at the changes I made to the Volta Energy section of the experience. So, first thing, I talked about the electronic enclosure in more detail. So, he asked me, don't just say electronic enclosure. So in terms of what it did, it tracked electrical signature data of large motors. Why did it do that? Well, it did that to eliminate unexpected downtime and reduce operating costs for customers. So that's me explaining what and why I did that particular project. Now, obviously, I didn't explain how I did it, so I kind of talk about that in the 2nd bullet point because I don't want to make this one too long. So I mentioned the enclosure was designed using Onshape for a production volume of 2,000 plus units, and it was fabricated via sheet metal formed 16 gauge alloy steel and finished with a durable NC65 gray powder coat. So that's specifically the material and manufacturing process of this enclosure that I worked on. Anytime I ever do a technical interview question, they always ask me about materials and production volume and manufacturing. So I just included it here, so now they don't keep asking these particular questions because the answer is all in here, and now they know that I have experience with materials and manufacturing. Also, my critiquer asked for more detail, so here it is. Also, anything he said that was redundant, I completely removed. He also talked about how important it is to mention cross-functional teams, so obviously I did that right here. I talked about all the teams I worked with, like electrical engineers and manufacturing, and kind of why I work with them and how they helped us. Specifically talking about how we were able to integrate the entire system together because I work with cross-functional teams. Any company I worked with had that kind of idea where you work with other teams to integrate the entire sub-assembly into one. Next up, we have serve robotics. Now, I spent a lot of time talking about this particular experience because this is the company I worked for the longest, like over a year. Honestly, I really liked that company, and if I could have, I would have worked there longer, but they ran out of money and had to lay people off. So it is what it is. First thing he wanted me to talk about is add more detail about the sub-assemblies that I worked on. Like add more detail, like was it the gear train, was it some electronic enclosure, what was it? So that's what I do here. So I talk about the fact that it was the front face assembly of the robot, and that consisted of camera brackets and sensor enclosures. I talk about how I designed it using SolidWorks, and it was molded with CNC machining, and it followed DFM and DFA guidelines. I talk about design and manufacturing here and the particular guidelines I followed, so I think it checks all the boxes for a mechanical engineering bullet point. He also mentioned that I should talk about thermal simulations and reliability testing, so I kind of briefly mentioned that here. Now I didn't go into too much detail about it because I didn't really have much space, but in like a separate Word document I kind of wrote out some notes on what the thermal testing I did and what the reliability testing I did. That way, when an interviewer asks me more details about these particular stuff, I'm able to address it pretty quickly. I don't have to come up with something on the spot. Again, just to be on the safe side, I mentioned 3D CAD and 2D engineering drawings because obviously I did it. I know I already mentioned it in Volta, but I did it in every work experience I had, so it's worth adding here as well. And now the next 3 bullet points, they're nothing really new. I had them in my last resume. He didn't critique them or say anything bad about them, so I kept it. Even in technical interviews, I've been asked about these resume bullet points quite a bit. Specifically this first one where I say manage an EVT build, building a team or leading a team of 10 plus operators, optimizing line configurations and creating detailed SOPs to produce a 98.6% yield output. That is something that I spent so much time working on at Serve Robotics because I would literally go to our manufacturing plant and I would actually literally lead a team to help us build these robots as fast as possible. We're building hundreds of robots in the span of a couple months. And being in charge of a team to build something so crazy was just insane to me, and it was such a fun experience. I would work for a long time. I was there from 6 a.m. sometimes, and I'd leave at 10 or 11 p.m. It wasn't obviously forever. It wasn't for a long time, but it was a long enough time that I'm so proud of that work. And when you get to see a robot walk off the line actually working, it's just such a beautiful and relieving feeling. And time would fly. But anyway, so I really like talking about that. And when interviewers ask me about this bullet point, I'm so excited to get into it. Next up, we have Tesla. Now, this part isn't really too long because it was almost, it was in 2021, so it was a while ago now. But first thing he did critique about on my Tesla experience in my initial resume was I needed to add more detail on the specific interior parts I worked on. So I kind of do that here. I say I worked on the instrument panel. I also talk about how I used CATIA V6 in order to design some of these parts. Also in my initial resume, I mentioned, launching some systems at Tesla. And so here I'm kind of talking about how I launched it and how I used PPAPs to do that. It's a common thing used in the automotive industry, so I kind of mentioned it. Maybe I can add a little bit more detail about it. I don't know, but I didn't really have much space, so I kind of just kept it at that. I thought if they had more questions, they could just ask me about it in the interview and I'll give them more detail. Next up, I also talk about the manufacturing processes I was designing parts for, like injection molding, sheet metal forming, and stamping. Now, I briefly mentioned that in my summary of qualifications, but I kind of wanted to specifically outline it in my work experience as well. He did ask me in my initial resume, I should probably mention more detail about these new attachment features that I had implemented. So I talk about snap fits because that's kind of mainly what I used in order to, connect different parts together. And they're commonly what are used in the automotive industry anyways, but I mentioned it because he did ask for more details, and snapshots are important in really any mechanical engineering application. Finally, he asked me to talk about cross-functional teams, so I did. I work with the design studio, I work with the thermals team at Tesla, so yeah, I mentioned it here because apparently it's really important. There's more teams I work with as well, like the body and white team and the audio team, but I didn't really get a chance to talk about it, and I didn't want this section to be too long. If they ask me in the interview, I'll talk about it, but I didn't really get into it too much. One other thing I know I can feel like I can improve is here when I say like, instrument panel parts. I feel like I can specifically say what instrument panel parts. I don't know if I'm allowed to say specifically which parts. It was 3 parts that I owned. Am I allowed to say it? I don't know. I'll probably ask him and see if I'm allowed. I don't want to get in trouble, so because these companies again are super secretive. I'll see. Worst case, I might add it in like the portfolio, or maybe only talk about it in the interview, like have a slide deck of the parts of images I found online and kind of talk about these are the parts I worked on, kind of my thought process behind them, the materials I use, the manufacturing I use, how I designed it. But in my resume, I don't know if it's okay for me to include it or not, because obviously I'm sending out my resume, it's public to any company, right? That was basically it for the experience and summary of qualifications section of my resume. Now there's the education section next. It's pretty simple. I just have the year I entered and the year I graduated, the major and the name of the university. I took out the GPA. There's no need, as he said. I've been out of uni for almost 3 years now. Now, that being said, when I do technical interviews, the name of University of Waterloo really matters a lot with them. Not just once or twice, but I think like 4 or 5 interviews I did with companies. They're like, yeah, we wanted to move forward and, move you to the next stage or give you this interview and talk to you because we just saw the name Waterloo and we know so many great things about Waterloo kids. We've heard such great, amazing things that obviously, because of their practical co-op experience, we want to hire them. And I was like, I don't want to just include the name University of Waterloo at the bottom because, sometimes people don't make it to the bottom of their resume. So that's why I included also, if you notice here at the top, Waterloo Engine alumnus. I included that because, hey, these companies really care about it. Before I only had, mechanical engineer written at the top of my resume, but I added the Waterloo Eng part. Maybe it'll help, maybe they'll see it and it'll increase my chance of getting an interview because it's amazing how such a strong name the University of Waterloo carries with these companies. But that's basically it for my resume and what it looks like now. Again, the biggest change is now it's 1 column and not 2. I can include the resume template in the video description as well if you want to have a look at it and maybe try it for yourself. I'm not saying you should, use this template because that's the only way to get a job. Because interestingly enough, one of my friends works at Tesla and he's like 5 or 6 years into the company now. So he hires interns. And a lot of the interns are giving him resumes and applying online. And they have my exact resume template. And he shows it to me and he's like, I think a lot of people have been watching your videos. It's amazing. I'm happy it brings you a value. I'm happy it's getting seen by hiring managers and recruiters. And it's helping you land the dream job that you want at these big tech companies. If you want to use this particular template as well, feel free to do so. I'm happy it brings you value. It's free. Obviously, I'm not charging for these templates. Just trying to give back and bring you value. But again, don't think like you have to use this template to get the job. Like, as long as you have good experience and a good portfolio, you'll get seen and you'll get interviews. Also, when I'm making these changes, I really only focus on my resume since he didn't really have anything negative to say about my portfolio. So I basically kept my portfolio the same. If anything, I'm probably just going to add to my portfolio like a little bit more detail about my Tesla experience and my Volta experience, but I'm only going to include images of, the actual product and images that I found online. I'm not including images that I got from work. Like if it's online, I'll include it. Otherwise, I'm not because of NDA. Now, after making all of these changes to my resume, I sent it out to him again to have him look at it one more time, see if he's got anything additional, any more feedback to give me. Because usually to get your resume kind of just right, it doesn't just happen after 1 or 2 iterations. Sometimes it might take like 3, 4, or even 5 iterations of having several people look at it and give you their feedback or opinion. I sent it out to him. Still waiting to hear back from his feedback. But I do think it was a much better improvement since the first iteration I had of my resume. Of course, there is still room for improvement, right? This is not just like a one and done thing. You continuously should always be improving your resume. Now, I hope this brought you a ton of value. and helped you figure out how you can even improve your own resume by watching me get my own resume critiqued. I think the feedback was super helpful. Obviously, it's super humbling as well to kind of get feedback from someone who's more experienced than you are. That's it. I'll see you in the next one. Peace!